Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country, around the world, inside Ukraine, and especially inside Utah, we have a very, very special opportunity to bring back a returning champion. When we rename this show, he was our first guest because he was so important to the movement of independents and unaffiliateds around this country and I think around the world. He has a lot to share since the last time he was here, but I'm very proud and thankful to welcome back the great and powerful Evan Mcmullin is back on Independent Americans. Welcome, sir.
Great to be back with you, Paul. Appreciate it.
It's been, it was February 2021 when you were last on this show. And a lot has changed, and I want to get into all of it. You're running for Senate. I think the country has changed dramatically around how they view and understand independence. We've got a war in Ukraine. You're engaged now. There's a lot that's happened.
Married.
Married. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sorry,
I
married.
got married. Yeah. Yeah. But to your point, yeah, a lot has changed.
I think you got engaged right after, and then you got married. All that's happened. In the
last 2 months later, we were married. Absolutely, that's the way we do it in Utah.
Well, you're on a fast track, and I think it's important for the country. But let me start by asking you a question I ask of everyone. Where are you and how are you, Evan?
Well, I'm in a place called Highland, Utah, and we are right up against the mountains here, and very fortunate to be so. And I'm happy. I'm a little bit tired. I think your viewers may sense that or see that, your viewers and listeners, but tired because we've been working hard and doing great things. And, we've made a lot of exciting progress, which I'm sure we'll get into, but, sometimes it's a good tired, when you've been through a fight, you've been through a battle, and it was a battle worth having, and it was, hopefully successful or worth having, even if it wasn't. And, so feeling good, though, worn a little, but still charged up to continue the fight.
Well, and the reward you get for fighting well is more fights to take on, and now
that's the way it works.
Now
Yeah.
You're doing that. Last time we talked to you, we really highlighted your run for president, and where you got a little over 20% in Utah. I said you were the most viable, maybe most important independent presidential candidate we've seen since Ross Perot. Now you are in what could be the most important Senate race in America. And I think a defining race for independence as well. You've launched since we first spoke. You've now been endorsed by the Democratic Party in Utah. This is a very big deal, not just for Utah and for independence, but for the Senate and for the country. So can you talk to us about why you decided to run for Senate in Utah, and why did you decide to run as an independent?
Well, I decided to run in the first place because our politics are just absolutely broken. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here with you and this audience, but look, we've got all these mounting challenges in the country, and we could go down the list, whether it's the high cost of healthcare, or here in Utah, we've got a serious air quality problem. We're in a historic drought. Cities are trucking in water. We've got inflation, obviously, that's, robbing money from most families who live paycheck to paycheck. It's, we've got all these mounting challenges. Now, we're just failing to overcome them because our leaders can't find common ground to solve problems, right? The extremes in our politics are so powerful these days that they won't allow any compromise, sensible solutions to be forged and implemented. And it's weakening the country. I think at this point, it's just putting our country at risk. And certainly on January 6th, we saw that those extremes have become quite bold and quite willing even to dismantle our system of self-government. And we now know that we knew then, but we now especially know that Senator Mike Lee, who I'm running against, was a key conspirator, I would say, in that process. And so we've got to make a change for Utah and for the nation. 65% or so of Utahns say they're ready to vote for an independent. 62% of Americans say they're poorly represented by either party. And I just think there's just a moment here in our country, perhaps you sense it too, I'm gathering that maybe you do, that this idea that we need to bring political change, and it's perhaps through an independent kind of lane, is just gaining momentum, and there's a lot of demand for it. So that's why I stepped in, and we've seen a tremendous response here in Utah, but around the country as well.
And you pretty much answered the question about why you decided to run as an independent, but you were a
Yeah,
Republican.
well,
You've
yeah,
been critical of the GOP. You've tried to pull them in the right direction. Mike Lee is a Trump supporter. He's a Trump apologist. He's probably a conspirator in what happened on January 6th. He's definitely a more favored candidate by Putin if he was going to pick between the two of you in Utah. But before we get to the specifics of him, which I do
yeah,
think are important as a test, you ran the numbers. Like, no Democrat has won statewide since the Attorney General in 1996, right? And correct me if I'm wrong on this. No Democrat has won in the Senate in Utah since 1970. So it's really bad for Democrats in Utah, right? And when they did a poll in February, they had Mike Lee at 34%, they had you at 24%, and they had Weston at 12%. Now Weston is going to be out, or he won't make as much of a difference without the support of his party. It looks like you can compete here as an independent. So is it a test about not only about Utah and about this moment, but about the independent brand? It's going to be. I feel like it's going to be. Obviously, independents are going to support. We'll see how many do. But it's going to be how independent is Utah? How many of them are willing to break with the Republican Party and Mike Lee in a state that went, I think, by 21 points to Trump in the last election?
yeah.
And you've got Democrats who the parties endorsed you. It was, it was a majority, but it wasn't unanimous. I think the question is how many Democrats are really independent enough to leave their party behind? So it feels like
Yeah.
the test of the next 2 years will be in your state. So how do you see
Yeah.
how do you see the landscape, and how do you plan to win? How do you plan to bring those folks together to actually vote for an independent candidate and break the party gridlock?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, look, the reason why I'm running as an independent is because of the following, and you nailed some of the numbers here. But most Utahns want to replace Mike Lee. Most Utahns want change, but they are divided into old historical political tribes: Democrats, Independents, Republicans, and members of third parties. Like we have the United Utah Party out here, and so we've got these different camps. They all want to make a change. They all want to replace Mike Lee. They all want to defend our system of self-government. They want similar things on a range of issues. They share values, but they're divided into these different historic camps. And there have been very few leaders who have come along and said, "Hey guys, you actually have more in common than you know. And if you work together, you can actually make change." Right now in Utah, certainly with Mike Lee, the only people who are represented are the far right. Everybody else is poorly represented in Utah. So I'm running as an independent because I want to unite this majority that wants to replace Mike Lee, that wants sensible governance, that wants government to work, that wants to stand up to the extremists that threaten our future. These people are a majority of the state, but they have to be united. We have to unite. And so that's what I'm campaigning to do. I asked the United Utah Party, instead of putting another candidate into the general election, vote to join my coalition. I asked the Democratic Party, instead of nominating someone else into the general election, vote to join my coalition. They both did that. And so, this will be a head-to-head race between Mike Lee and me, a clear choice between somebody who wants to tear down our democracy and somebody who wants to make it work for all Americans and for Utah especially. So that's why it's both. In politics, it's sometimes it's rare for the political strategy and the kind of and the leadership needs of the country to align. But in this case, they certainly do. I think the country just needs more independent leaders who aren't going to take their cues from party bosses from other states or from special interest groups. We're not taking any special interest group money. We need leaders who will act more independently, but that is also the way and the only way here to win in Utah. So those two things are very nicely aligned. It's sort of the leadership needs of the state and the country, but also the strategy. And I'm talking about our strategy very openly, that it is what it is. Unite this majority, and that's what we're working overtime to do.
And I think that's going to be the true test here. It's more like a European model of cobbling together alliances, right, and creating
Coalition
a coalition
politics.
coalition
Yeah.
politics, which we've talked a lot about on this show. And if I look at the macro, right, there's a trend that I see happening. You and I were talking about this before we hit record. I mean, I think there is a real moment now, and that's why I started an independent media company, because I think I want to talk to and for and with those people and focus on these issues. I think there's a thirst for an independent media company. I think if you look at things like the rise of the Lincoln Project, we had Steve Schmidt on last week. Andrew Yang has now started his own effort. Kinzinger's been on this show before and may run for president as an independent option. You know, these different factions are finding success. And we'll see if they can actually coalesce. A lot of them are Republicans who've changed jerseys, right? Or Democrats who've changed jerseys. Guys like you or guys like Yang. But I think the real question is there a new generation coming up that never wore one jersey or the other, that is open to this and will turn out and will vote and will raise money? So on the macro, I see it, but there's also kind of a personal moment that you've got to capture. And I think about somebody like Jesse Ventura, right? Like, he had a unique profile. He was viewed as an everyman and a fighter and a person who could cross partisan lines. A lot of folks dismiss him now, got that. But if you go back to when he was really, really rising, there was a populism to him. So I think there's a question of whether or not you can capture that as a former CIA operative, as a person who's grown up in Utah, as a family person. Can you talk about that? How are you going to capture and really balance your national appeal with your local authenticity? Because you got to raise money, right? You're going to have to raise a lot of money, and I think you got half of what Mike Lee's got now. He's got roughly $2 million. I don't know what your latest filing is, but maybe you've got $1 million. You're going to have national appeal. So how do you capture that as the embodiment of a new breed of independence?
Yeah, well, absolutely. You know, in our first quarter in the race, we outraised Mike Lee by 58%. And of course, he'd been raising money for 12 years or 11 years before that. So he had a little in the bank, but we've got to play catch up. But we're keeping pace with him, and we hope to do much better than that. And I think now that it's a clear head-to-head race between Mike Lee and me, we can do that. But we need everybody's help to catch up, because again, he had a decade head start. But look, I will say that, for me, it's about making sure that government is responsive and accountable to people, actually, right? And I just don't think it is anymore in many cases. And that is, I guess, yes, a populist message, but it's also just the right message, and it's right for Utah too. I mean, Mike Lee, for example, talking about money in our first, I don't know what it was in the last quarter, but in our first quarter in the race, 43% of Mike Lee's money came from PACs and special interest groups. We took $0. We took not a cent from PACs and special interest groups. So that tells you, if you wonder, if you're a Utahn, why doesn't Mike Lee represent me? Why doesn't he care what I think? Many Utahns say to me, look, he won't even take my meeting. If he does take my meeting, he tells me what he thinks I should know. He doesn't listen. I mean, I hear that all the time. And you wonder, well, why not? Well, follow the money. It's because he is supported broadly by extremist organizations and special interest groups and PACs. That's where Mike Lee gets his money. And that's why Utahns don't have a voice. That's why he was willing to take the Senate seat that he has, because we put him there, and use it to try to dismantle our democratic republic. That's how bad things have gotten. And so, my message is that I want the power to rest in the hands of the people, which means, standing up to moneyed interests that decrease the influence of people in our politics. I want to say, look, and I am saying I'm not going to be accountable to party bosses. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do it, and I don't care. And many people say, oh, you can't do that. They wag their finger at me and say, you can't be an independent. You can't do that. That's not the way the system is. First of all, they don't understand the rules of the system. Yes, I can be an independent, and I will be an independent. And that's what the country needs. And it upsets those who are trying to protect the status quo that is no longer serving people. But it upsets them because their interest is holding on to power. My interest is returning it to the people. So I guess that's a bit of a populist message, but it is the message that it is the kind of leadership that we need for Utah's sake, but also for the country.
I think I think it's a test of the independent brand too, right? Like I've seen you're saying independent for Senate, right? Like we're going to see how that brand of independent, and a lot of people view it differently. I know that as a guy who runs, a show called Independent Americans. People view them on many different political spectrums, but I think it's going to be a test of that brand in this moment in Utah, right? And as you think about your strategy to build a coalition, part of your strategy could also be to divide your opponent. And the Republican Party is got Mike Lee, but they've also got Mitt Romney. You've got, a relatively moderate senator on the other side. So Mitt Romney is a key factor here, I think. Do you want Mitt Romney's endorsement, and do you expect to get it?
Well, I would say that Mitt Romney's most recent comments on the race were something like Evan McMullin and Mike Lee are both friends of mine, and I'm going to stay out of the race, which is incredibly helpful for us, frankly. I mean, Senator Lee is Senator Romney's Republican colleague. He's vulnerable, and most of the state wants to replace him. He's in for the toughest political race of his life, and to have Senator Romney, acknowledge that or decide to not engage in his support is very helpful to us, and that I think has sent a strong message that we appreciate it very much. And I understand the partisan dynamics there are very difficult, and so I don't know what Senator Romney will do going forward, but I certainly respect his leadership. I think he's proven to be a tremendous patriot. I mean, talk about independence. I mean, he was willing to buck his entire party. I think he's the only senator in the history of the country who has been willing to vote for conviction of an impeached president of their own party. I mean, that's something. Talk about independence. So I really appreciate his leadership. I know many Utahns do. He's got the support of most Utahns. Senator Lee does not, but Mitt Romney has the support of most Utahns. And, I respect his leadership. I'm not sure what he'll do going down the road, but he's a good man and a good friend. And I appreciate what he does in the Senate for Utah and for the country.
So it sounds like, yes, you want his endorsement if you can get it.
Well, yeah, of course, but he's got a lot to think about, and
Yeah.
whatever he does, I'll respect, but he's already doing a lot to help the country and the state, and I'm most grateful for that.
Well, you're being very diplomatic, and I think that's one of your strengths. But it's also gut check time for Mitt Romney, in my view, right? As an independent who wants to see Republicans stand up for our values and stand up for the rule of law and stand up for country over party. I think that there've been a lot of moments in the last few years where everyone's looking to Mitt Romney, and they've looked to Susan Collins, and they've looked to so many others. Like, what will they do? But I think this might be one of the biggest gut check moments for Mitt Romney yet. And not just if he does it, but when he does it. Right? If he waits till the very end, there's an advantage there to you. If he does it much earlier, he has the ability to raise money. He has a very big national media profile. He could be a part of a new Republican Party or even a breakaway group of people who join an independent movement. So, I'm going to be watching him closely, and I think folks should definitely keep the heat on him. As if you're an independent, and you need Mitt Romney and other allies to stand with folks like Evan McMullin, in my view. But as we think about that unfolding, Evan, Ukraine is the story of our time right now. You're running against a guy in Mike Lee who is not involved in the discussions around Ukraine. I was going to get to it with Steve Schmidt last week, but for folks who don't know, his internet went down. We couldn't get him back up. I think maybe it was the Russians meddling with his internet or mine. But as we think about Ukraine, I think the question is, will Ukraine matter in the elections in America this fall? Everybody says it's always the economy, stupid, or it's all about local politics. But I believe there are some races and some candidates where Ukraine can be more relevant. You are a former CIA operative. Mike Lee, to my knowledge, hasn't served in the military or anywhere else really significant in the national security community. So Ukraine is going to be front and center. You can make it more front and center. But he's also a guy who's enabled Trump, who has defended him and his dealings around Ukraine. So you have an ability to make Ukraine an issue here. So can you talk about, I want to get your analysis on the actual situation in Ukraine, but the politics of Ukraine.
Yeah.
How much do you think it will be a factor in Utah in your race?
Well, let me start with the politics. Paul, if you and I were both here in Utah and we took a drive around, Salt Lake County and Utah County and elsewhere, we would see Ukrainian flags on people's homes, or people have switched out their outdoor lights so that they're not just, white or yellow lights, they're gold and blue. I mean, that's what's happening here. I think, many Utahns really from across the political spectrum realize that this is a fight between the forces of tyranny and the forces of liberty in Ukraine. But I would say that it's this is part of a global struggle. There's a global struggle right now between the free world and the rise of the authoritarian regimes, and both in China and Russia and elsewhere. That's what the struggle is right now. The world is grappling with whether it will move in the direction of liberty or tyranny. And we see that, of course, taking place kinetically, very kinetically in Russia. But the same struggle exists here in America and elsewhere around the world, in Europe, elsewhere outside of Ukraine, and really around the world. So that's the context in which I understand this. But I've been very encouraged to see so many Utahns, again, from across the political spectrum, showing their support for Ukraine, joining the cause. Now, how this impacts my particular race to replace Mike Lee is this. You mentioned that Mike Lee has been silent in this because he's in a very difficult spot. He has not been, however, silent over the last several years. Let's talk about that record. So in 2017, Vladimir Putin had just interfered in our election, just tried to impact the direction of our country through swaying an election. And senators were voting on sanctions of Putin's regime. And only 2 US senators voted against those sanctions. I bet you can guess one of them. Yes, Mike Lee. The other one was Rand Paul.
Rand Paul. Exactly. We know who it's going to be.
Yeah,
It's also the same 2 guys who voted to block the 9/11 first responders healthcare bill. So I have to take a moment to add that as well. We know who they're going to be. They're the same guys over and over again.
Not hard to predict, right? Yep. But it doesn't stop there. So they vote against sanctions. The only 2 guys in the Senate to do it. Then a year and a half later, a bipartisan group of senators were planning to travel to Moscow. I'm not sure, it was a CODEL, that's what they call it, a trip for senators, right? It was bipartisan. So they're getting ready to travel, and they send in their visa applications to the Russian embassy, and Moscow denies all of their visa applications except for one. Guess who that was? Mike Lee. And so all of the other senators were rejected, but not Mike Lee. Mike Lee gets a visa from Moscow. And you'd think that Mike Lee might then say, you know what, I'm not going to go. If my colleagues aren't going, I'm not going to be the only one to go. But instead, he decides to go. And somebody asks him to go alone. Somebody asks him, why are you going? And he says, well, I'm going to discuss religious liberty. So he shows up, he meets with the Russian officials. He leaves the meeting, and the press asks the Russian officials, so how was the meeting? What'd you talk about? And the Russians say, it was a great meeting. We talked about lifting sanctions. And then the journalists asked Mike Lee, did you talk about lifting sanctions? And he said, well, yeah, we should reconsider whether we should still have sanctions on Russia. So here he is traveling to Moscow alone, having voted against sanctions. Now he's in Moscow talking about lifting them. And he's changed his story about what he said in that meeting, and we'll never know. But we do know he voted against them. He has voted against about $2 billion worth of military aid to Ukraine since the Russians first started their invasion in 2014. Now, he says, well, they were part of larger bills, and there were other things in the bills he didn't like. I mean, that's always what these guys say. But the point is, when you vote against these funding bills, you're voting against really critical stuff. And in this case, it was life or death, for Ukrainians, and he was against it. Then he defended Donald Trump when Donald Trump withheld aid to Ukraine. He said that he didn't think Donald Trump had done anything impeachable, but also that he hadn't done anything wrong, right? Most Republicans, or many Republicans, said it was wrong but not impeachable, not Mike Lee. Mike Lee said it wasn't anything wrong. Then he challenged internal NATO deployments when Russia, escalated, recently in this new invasion of Ukraine, and said that those internal NATO deployments were a violation of the War Powers Act if Biden didn't report them to Congress, et cetera. Anyway, my point is just that time and time again, he has been carrying Putin's water. He is a Putin appeaser. He's soft on Putin. And it's that kind of figure in American politics that I think has invited Russian aggression here in the United States and in Europe. And so you can bet this is going to be an issue. It already has been. We've been making an issue of it. We just can't afford to have somebody representing Utah in the US Senate who's so soft on Putin. And I think that puts it nicely. I think what Lee was doing is catering to the far right because he thought it would be to his political benefit. But he did so at the expense of our security and of global security. The reason why we're paying $5 or $6 for a gallon of gas right now is because Mike Lee thought it made sense to appease Putin.
You are being diplomatic again and saying he appeased Putin. I would argue he's enabled Putin,
That's a better word. Yeah.
And that's why this race is so important, because this is about our national security, all of us, even if you don't live in Utah. It's also about accountability. It's about whether or not there will be accountability for the things you do that hurt our national security, hurt our domestic security, hurt our integrity as a nation. So you've got the advantage of a voting record to run against. You've got some pretty sweet ammunition here for attack ads. I mean, and that's why that money is going to be important. If you can make this case to the people of Utah, if you can make them aware simply of his voting record, I think you're going to have an advantage here. That's a fair one. That's a clear one and a fair one, and one that's going to resonate far beyond Utah. I want to stay on Ukraine for a minute, because it's so important to this community in particular, and ask you a question that is part of why I like you as a candidate. I can ask this of you where I can't really ask this of anybody else running for senator in the Senate. You worked in the CIA. You have been on the front lines of the intelligence fight and on protecting America's national security in this dangerous post 9/11 world. Can you give us your perspective, in whatever way you're comfortable, on the intel fight? Because I think there's been a lot of talk about the kinetic fight. Even we're talking about the prospect of nukes, but there's an entire underside of this that most Americans don't pay attention to, aren't tracking on. But there's a reason why. There are many reasons why the Ukrainians are so effective. But they're getting some pretty good intel from U.S. intelligence sources right now on locations of weapons batteries and many other things. So from your expert, opinion, you're going to be, by default, maybe the expert in the CIA, in the Senate on the CIA and on intelligence. What's your analysis of the fight from an intel standpoint right now, and what will be really important going forward?
Well, I think it's already played a huge role, obviously. I mean, even leading up to Russia's renewed or escalated invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. government was calling out Russia's moves, and I think that was just brilliant. And you saw the UK doing the same thing. I think that was very important, and it's continued, and we ought to continue to absolutely to do that. I certainly support our provision of tactical and strategic intelligence to the Ukrainians as they fight this battle. We ought to be training them as well to improve their own capacities. Although, to be honest, they were already pretty darn good. But we have a lot of capacities that they don't, and using those to help them fight more effectively. I mean, yes, we're providing the kinetic capacities to take out tanks and aircraft and do a range of other things, and I'm in favor of that. But in order for all of that to be used effectively, they've got to have the intel support too. And I don't have special knowledge. I'm out, but I of course we're providing intelligence help, and I certainly support it. I imagine we have operators on the ground there collecting intelligence, training Ukrainians on different capacity, different ways to collect more. I'm sure we're providing technical capabilities that they didn't have before. All of that stuff is critical. You've got to have the brains, the brains and the muscle, and that's how you fight effectively. And so we've got to do both.
Mm. You're going to be hopefully in the Senate, and you're going to be a key player in driving what will likely still be a needed response from America on the war in Ukraine. I mean, this, in my view, could go on for years. We've talked about Putin's strategic mindset and how he could be willing to wait out a Democrat. A Republican wave sweeping out the Democrats in the House, and even potentially the rise of Trump again, and maybe a Trump presidency. So as we look at the long view of combating Putin, and I don't think this ends until he's gone or dead. I've been open about saying that. As you look toward a Senate race that will unfold as the war is unfolding, what do you want to see the U.S. do on Ukraine that we're not doing already, Evan?
Well, I have to say that I think what we're doing is directionally the right thing. I mean, what have we done? Let's remember, we've isolated Putin's regime. I mean, I think, frankly, we've been far more successful on that front. There's still some holdout countries, obviously, that we need to work on, and as a country, we are working on them as a coalition. But to have mobilized the world the way we have, I think is for me very encouraging. I mean, we just went through a period of time during the Trump administration when really the free nation alliances were weakened by an American president who decided to align at least himself with Vladimir Putin, and that is changing. I mean, I think this, as terrible of a crisis this is, and it is terrible, it has allowed America to step in again to offer leadership with our allies. We can't do it alone. But I think that's been a very good thing. We've isolated Putin's regime. We've isolated Russia in general, but especially his regime. We've rallied the free world against his invasion of Ukraine and really against his malign activities globally. We provided all kinds of military support. I think we should continue to do that. I'm in favor of, I think we do need to provide, the MiGs. I think we do need to provide artillery. I think we need to provide all of the equipment that Ukraine needs to defend itself. But I don't want to see sort of conventional U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine. I am worried about America enforcing a no-fly zone itself, because I think that could lead to an escalatory cycle that we can't control. At this stage, I say these things. Now, things can change over time, but I think we need to do everything in our power to allow the Ukrainians to fight effectively for themselves. And that means equipment, it means intelligence, it means a ton of humanitarian aid. That's an important piece to this, because those fighters, those guys are, men and women. Actually, it's not just men. I think the men are required to stay, but many women are there fighting too, of all ages. Yep. And so, we need to stand with them and provide to them the capacity to fight. And that's where I am right now on it. And I'm for, additional equipment in quantity and quality, but allowing them to fight the fight themselves as we manage the sort of the isolation of Putin's regime. We've also got to definitely get ourselves off of Russian energy, get the world off of Russian energy. That's a whole other topic about where we go with energy in general. But all of these things. But I think we're headed down the right road on most of these things. It's just how fast do we do it?
I think there's a real momentum in the last couple of weeks, and especially with Secretary Austin, Defense Secretary Austin now leading the charge now. I think he's a person, people are underestimating the depth of his connections across Europe as a known quantity on the global stage. And I think he and Blinken have been really picking up steam in the last couple of days especially. And I hope you'll come back to talk about this and much more in the months to come. I know you've agreed to graciously stick around for a couple of quick fire questions for our Patreon members. Shout out to them. Thank you for keeping the fires going here and continuing to help us bring this content. Let me ask you a last question, which is kind of a layup. It's a question, but it's also a request. Number one, we've covered a lot on this show, 9/11 first responders issues, the Zadroga bill, and the need for health care. Mike Lee has been a block on that throughout, and I ask you to please hold him accountable on that for those of us outside of Utah. And there will be a test for him, too, on a massive piece of burn pit legislation impacting veterans that could come before the Senate for a vote, we hope, this fall. And if passed is a predictor, he might be the guy blocking it again, just like he and Rand Paul did last time on cost. And I hope if he does, you will light him up and make that a national issue. And I think part of why that leads me to the last question is, how can we help? If we're independents around the country, in Utah or somewhere else, or even around the world, how can folks support your campaign and help you win?
Well, I really appreciate that, Paul, and certainly I'll be watching those pieces of legislation closely, and happy to be an advocate and to hold Lee accountable, which we're doing every single day. But yes, we need the help of the broader independent community. And by the way, when I say that, people are registered, many people are registered as Republicans or Democrats or members of third parties, libertarians, but they still think of themselves as more independent, right? They're not simply following party, dictates. They're thinking for themselves. They're willing to cross party lines to do the right thing for the country. They're patriots. They're putting the people of this country and the broader interests of the country first. So we need the support of a national independent movement. that is happening. I'm encouraged to say people are joining us from around the country, certainly in Utah, where a third of Utahns are registered independents, and about 40% of Utahns vote like they're independent. So they may 10%, are registered one side or the other, but they behave like independents. So we need everybody to join us. How can you do that? You can go to our website, evanmcmullin.com. You can volunteer there. If you're able to chip in and donate, please do what you can. This is an important fight. Mike Lee's got all the PACs and special interest groups and extremist groups at his side. But we're capable of outraising him and doing what we need to do with your support. And that's why we've been able to do that, because people are stepping up from around the country and from within Utah. The other thing I would say is, there's all kinds of news about what we're doing. Share it with your friends. Share it on social media. You may say, well, look, I've only got a few hundred followers and friends on this platform or that platform. I don't care. We all have our spheres of influence, and oftentimes the smaller your sphere of influence is, the more influence you have within it, because those relationships are deeper. And so don't count yourself out because you don't have 1 million followers on Twitter. Don't worry about that. You've got a sphere of influence. You drop that pebble in the pond and those ripples will go on beyond your vision. And so please share with your friends what we're doing, invite them to the cause, and volunteer yourselves, contribute where you can. And that's how you can help.
Well, we've said a lot in this show that advocacy isn't a big bang, it's a drumbeat. And I think all of us can echo that drumbeat and support that drumbeat. I call it like it is. This is not just Evan Mcmullin versus Mike Lee. This is America versus Putin. This is the future versus the past. This is patriots versus the others. I mean, this is really about a true test, a gut check for America that's about so much more than you, frankly. And it is a case study for America right now, but I encourage everybody to learn more, to support, to spread the word, and to understand that this is about much more than each of us and about much more than Evan. And I'm grateful that you've stepped up to be that guy. I hope you're the first of many more that we see, and that this generates a whole new generation of a movement. And part of that is showing you can win. Everybody says independents can't win, that they're going to give it to the other guy or gal. This is a defining test for our movement as independent Americans, but also for America. And I've said before, you don't have to be registered or unaffiliated to support the right thing. And this is the right thing. So you're the right thing, man. We're rooting for you. Thank you for leading the charge. I hope you get to enjoy that amazing outdoors that you love in Utah. You're going to stick around, I know, for a couple more questions for our Patreon members. But thank you for what you're doing, and keep it up, man.
Thank you so much, Paul.